there may be others. New Grit is a look at 25 artists, as Laurie said, who have different kinds of connections to Philadelphia, but they're all making really vibrant work today. And it's been a great joy to work on it with 3 of my colleagues. So it's a team of curators talking about a team of artists. And of course, Daniel is another one of the artists in New Grit. It is my pleasure to introduce Daniel this evening. Daniel Traub was born and raised in Philadelphia, and he returned to live here in 2019 after more than 2 decades living in New York City and in various cities in China. Since the 1990s, Daniel has built a body of documentary photography and film that looks at peripheral or marginal urban spaces and examines how people navigate those zones. This work has taken him to many places in the world: the town of Nablus on Palestine's West Bank, multiple cities in China, which I think we'll learn about this evening, and neighborhoods in New York City and Philadelphia, among other places. The people who come before Daniel's lens are often anonymous portrait subjects, but he has made documentary films about artists, including Lily Ye, Zhu Bing, and Ursula von Riedingsvard, which extend some of the themes in his photographs. And for me, Daniel, this is one of the fascinating aspects of your work, that you work very ambitiously, both in film and in photography. And there are wide differences, but also points of convergence between these two streams of practice in your work. Now, examples from 2 bodies of Daniel's photographic work are currently included in New Grit, Art in Philly Now, which, as I said, I helped organize at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. The series North Philadelphia comprises landscapes and portraits made in this city between 2008 and 2013, while Little North Road, the other series we have on view, consists of photographs Daniel made in Guangzhou, China, between 2009 and 2014. And I first saw Little North Road, of course, when it was exhibited here at the Slot Foundation, I believe in 2016. And I was just blown away by those pictures, and we were able to acquire 2 of them at the time for the museum, which I was really happy about. Now, I have long been fascinated by the overlapping nature of these 2 projects by Daniel, where he was in many overlapping years making serious work both in Guangzhou and in Philadelphia. And I'm excited that we are showing them together for the first time at PMA. I do hope you'll come see New Grit. The exhibition is on view until August 22nd, just a little plug there. Tonight, Daniel is going to talk about both of these projects, as well as some of his earlier work in China that preceded them. And I just can't wait to hear about it all. So please join me in welcoming Daniel Traub. Hi, Daniel.
Hi. Thank you. Thanks, Peter, Laurie, Sarah, and thanks everyone for being here. I guess I want to, well, first, Peter, I hope we can kind of not only me be presenting, but we kind of keep it as a dialogue. And
sure.
I might have questions for you as well.
I'm ready.
Yeah, so primarily, I'm not going to show too many images. I wanted to kind of leave some space for us to talk. But as you said, the main projects I want to talk about are North Philadelphia and Little North Road, because those are actually projects that are very important for me, because in a way they kind of clarified a lot of things that I was working on, and they're also projects that became book projects and were published. And I think it took me a long time to kind of reach those projects. So I'll sort of frame it by talking about, as you said, my China work from when I moved to China from 1998 to 2007. Let me share my screen here.
I'll just, while you're doing that, I'll say I'm quite embarrassed. I forgot to mention your books. They're both down here in my introduction. Daniel has published 2 fantastic books, both with Kara Verlag. The first was North Philadelphia, which I think was 2014, if I'm not getting the date wrong. And the next was Little North Road, 2016. And Little North Road received a lot of critical attention, in part because of the amazing way that Daniel brought his own work together with that of two itinerant portrait photographers who I know he's going to mention tonight and show work by. So those are two great books on my shelf and important books. So that's part of Daniel's bio.
Okay. Does everybody see the screen?
Yes.
So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what brought me to China originally. My mother is Chinese. My mother's in the audience here, and I think in aspects I wanted to explore that part of my heritage. I grew up biracial. I grew up in Philadelphia, but I was had her influence in her, the language and her kind of sort of this sort of family history was sort of part of what I grew up with, and sort of this, in a way, this alternate world of China. And so in a way, I wanted to go to China to kind of reconcile, what I had grown up with the actual China that was there. That was one part, but it was also, I had just gotten out of graduate school, and China at the time was, this was in '98, it was just not so much on the world's attention in the way it is now. It was kind of a place where, in a way, finding its own footing and trying to kind of building up to the Olympics 10 years later. And it was a place where there actually weren't that many foreign journalists or foreign photographers working at the time. So I sort of sensed that it would be a place where I could kind of find a way in the world for myself as a professional photographer. And also, I really wanted to just go and leave New York and kind of be out in the world and sort of find my own voice as an artist. So here's.
Daniel, had you traveled to China before this as a child?
I had been there in the 80s a couple of times when I was, my mother actually led tours. She was teaching at PCA, University of the Arts, and she led some tours of her students, and I sort of tagged along as I think a 9-10-year-old. So I saw a very, very different China in the 80s. And then when I also went back, I think in the early 90s at some point on a short trip, and then sort of decided to make a plunge and just move there altogether. And so initially I moved to Beijing, and I spent first I pretty quickly got a job as a cameraman working for German television. And I in a way, at that time, it was quite relatively easy to get work in the foreign media because there weren't too many people. And I think because I speak Chinese, I was able to kind of use that, without having too much experience as a cameraman. I got work pretty quickly. And but that was sort of my day job. And then on my time off, I would just wander Beijing and sort of just interact and explore. And I ended up making these, really kind of interacting with people and making these street portraits, just wandering the streets. Here's another. This is actually in Chengdu, another city, but primarily I was working in the city I was living in Beijing. This is Beijing. And I found that, for the first maybe 3 or 4 years, I was just kind of interacting and sensing that this place was really in this kind of tumult. That people were, in a sense, trying to find their own, what it means to be Chinese at that moment, in a way, in between kind of the opening up period and also, this kind of very fast consumerism, this kind of changed capitalism. And one thing that was happening at the time is the cities were, many migrant workers were pouring into the cities. And this was something that really, over kind of gradually, I became more and more interested in, and not even really consciously, but I sort of found myself photographing these migrant workers, and I've sort of thought that there's a few different reasons. I think there's an aspect, my own family, my grandfather was an orphan, and he grew up in some degree of poverty. So I think in my family there were certain narratives about his struggles. So I felt a kind of identification with this group. But also there was also the sense that these people were somewhat invisible in the larger society, and I felt a kind of just sort of interest in exploring these people who I in a way I felt a kind of sympathy, or I don't know, kind of moved by them. There's something very real and kind of gritty, and there's a kind of tenaciousness about them. So I later on, when I was at Beijing, I became more and more sort of conscious about going specifically out to the outskirts of Chinese cities, Beijing, and later to Shanghai, and looking at this the landscape where the migrant workers were largely, in a way, forced to live, because they were kind of not really accepted into the city proper, and were the migrant workers were really kind of a floating, almost like a floating country within China. They were the people that were really building China and sort of populating the factories, and in a sense the backbone of the economy at that time. But they were really not allowed to be part of the mainstream economy.
Daniel, what are we seeing here in this photograph? I mean, all of this, it looks like furniture or construction material. So this
is, in 2005, I moved to Shanghai, and I started to look specifically at the outskirts of Shanghai. And this is a migrant community that actually built. Well, you can see the skeleton of these buildings. It was actually like a luxury villa that was abandoned because somehow the financing fell apart, and this group of migrant workers came in and basically built a shanty town within this skeleton. And then they were making a living by collecting the door frames and window frames of demolition that was happening in Shanghai at that time. So I mean, in a way, this photograph encapsulates a lot of what was happening in that landscape. It was this constant sense of flux where these high-rise luxury villas were being built and then abandoned for whatever reason, and then this kind of floating population would move in and build this whole other informal economy there. And in a way, a lot of the outskirts of Chinese cities at that time had that quality of this constant kind of churning energy. It was really like these two worlds, in a way, the agricultural and the urban China intersecting and kind of colliding. So it was really this very intense space. And I originally intended to do kind of a broader documentary or larger project about this, but I came back, I think 2 weeks later, to the same place, and the whole place had been razed, presumably to make space for some other luxury villa that was going to go there. So it was really yeah, this place in particular is really emblematic of China at that time, in a sense.
So the government would just come in and raise, I mean, presumably also.
I really don't know what it was. It might have been, a developer who was going to build malls there or other luxury villas. And I mean, I was, when I went back there, I was completely shocked. And,
wow.
Yeah. This is another group of. This was actually a group of farmers who were flooded off their land in Anhui province during one of the floods of the Yangtze River. And they decided to, as a way to make a living, they got a truck and became these sort of burlesque performers, became this sort of burlesque troupe that performed for other migrants who were also living on the outskirts of different cities. This is also Shanghai. So it was really this, sub community within sort of performing for each other. These migrants were performing, and it was also very specific to the outskirts of Chinese cities.
Is the tent? Was that the performing tent?
Yeah.
Wow.
And these were in the foreground. These are migrant workers.
So I've known this photograph for a long time, and I've always loved it. I think SF MoMA owns this picture, and tell us about the decision you made. I mean, you obviously you've decided to focus on the tent and the people in the background, and you've blurred everybody in the foreground. What were you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, these are all large format photographs. So I was shooting 4x5s at the time, so it's not quite as precious as 8x10. So I actually tend to shoot quite a lot when I was shooting 4x5. So there was some room for experimentation. I would try getting everyone in focus, and then tried putting people out. But I guess I like this because it's somehow speaks to this group of people that are in some ways invisible or faceless. I mean, maybe it's a little heavy-handed, but I guess I felt that it works in this picture, and it kind of focuses your picture, your focus beyond them, this group, to the tent. And one thing that I sort of developed at that time was I was mostly focused or interested in the landscape, how the landscape embodies all these changes at the time. But I would also come across people that caught my eye, people that I wanted to photograph, or something about them drew me to them. Or people would also come up to me and ask to be photographed. So that became something that I sort of incorporated into this way of working with the large format camera. And in a way, there were they became kind of these interactions or little short collaborations in a sense, because I would take quite a few frames and spend quite a bit of time, partly because the 4x5 takes a long time to kind of set up, and so in that time you sort of get to know people a little bit, and it's not like where you take a picture and then walk away. So there is a kind of interaction there. And this is a migrant community, also actually in Beijing. It's a group of villagers who made a living collecting bottles and recyclables outside of Beijing. Actually, one thing I'll mention, just you asked earlier about my film work, and in some ways the portrait work that I do, I see as in a way they're these sort of short collaborations that I've done with people, strangers that I encountered largely. Most of the films I've made have also been portraits of a kind. Sometimes I was commissioned to make a film. Other times they're projects where I was sort of drawn to a particular person, or for whatever reason. I made a film about my mother, and also a film about Xu Bing, who's an artist, a Chinese artist who's done a lot of work about Chinese culture, also about migrant workers. So in a way, the films don't feel so different in the sense that they're also these kind of more in-depth portrait sessions where they're also kind of a collaboration between the subject and myself.
Daniel, I see that overlap between your films and your photographs, and I enjoy it a lot. So I'm curious about your decision. As I understand it, most of your photographic portraits are untitled. You're not getting into the biographies of your sitters, and I'm just curious about that decision by you, since you speak of them as collaborative projects.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason is in some projects I have put names on them. I think it's a matter of the depth that I know somebody. Like if I feel like I can really say that they're somebody I have a relationship with, then I put a name to them. I guess in other projects I felt, well, let me move on to North Philadelphia because I think it's maybe more relevant. Well, let me just start with North Philadelphia. Now I'll get back to this question. When after almost 10 years in China, I sort of felt that I had reached, I guess a closing point, or I felt like there wasn't really any more that I wanted to do in China at the time, and it was also the Olympics were coming up, and in a way, it was sort of like a natural point of closure for my time in China, because in a way, all of China was sort of gearing up for that moment, in a way, and I sort of saw my own work as documenting, the transformation of China leading up to that, and I also sort of came to this realization that if I didn't leave pretty soon, that it would be harder and harder for me to leave China, and I didn't really see myself, staying there indefinitely. So I started to think about where I wanted to go next. What would be the next step, and also in a sense having developed a way of working in China. In a sense, also, I think after working in the outskirts of Chinese cities, and in these kind of peripheral spaces, I sense that could also be there was something there for me in general, not just in China. Like I sense that this is something that I could look at in other countries and maybe in other spaces, that these spaces on the periphery, there's something, in a sense, charged, or they somehow reveal something more important about the country. In a way, that the main issues that animate a country can be found there, like the migrant workers, the development, the clash between development and poverty. So I was looking for something to do next. And at the time, the kind of images from North Philadelphia, from my home city, kind of kept coming to my mind. I'm going to jump ahead, and you can see they're quite similar. Actually, I mean, I guess I saw a relationship to what I had been photographing in Philadelphia, in China, to or it sort of reminded me of things that I had remembered from Philadelphia. And I sort of decided to, I guess I wanted to explore these issues that I've been looking at in China in the United States more broadly. And I guess I felt like Philadelphia, as it was the place where I grew up, it was a place I knew would be a good place to start. So I moved back to Philadelphia in 2008, and started pretty quickly to work in Philadelphia, in North Philadelphia specifically. And I think the reason, there's quite a few different reasons why I chose that neighborhood. But one is that I had spent quite a lot of time there when I was a teenager, working at my mother's project on Germantown Avenue, called the people in Philadelphia will know this, the Village of Arts and Humanities. And it's a project that she founded, converting vacant lots in the Hartranft neighborhood of North Philadelphia into sculpture gardens and community spaces. And when I was about 14, 15, I spent quite a lot of time there, kind of working, alongside people in the neighborhood. And I think it really made a very deep impression on me, because I think at the time as a teenager, I also, growing up in Center City, it was kind of like this, very privileged bubble. But I sensed, I was, very aware that Philadelphia, was this very sprawling city with, in a way, it's kind of schizophrenic. It was basically white in the center, and then, Black and lots of different other groups. And I think working at that place at that time really sort of rang true. Like it made sense, and it wasn't so much that I was aware of the injustice of it, but I think I was maybe moved by the sense of possibility that I experienced there. So I think when I moved back to China, on the one hand, I wanted to look at these broader issues of inequality that I had seen in China in the United States, but I also, it was kind of a more sort of personal place to start. I guess I had a relationship with that neighborhood and wanted to kind of revisit that place.
I wanted to ask you, Daniel, something that relates to this, which is, in China, you started looking at what I'll call peripheral spaces, or these sort of zones outside the city or at the edge of the city. And I was wondering how you subjectively felt. Like, were you aware of yourself as an outsider, and did that change as you went from city to city, not just in China, but everywhere you've worked, including Philadelphia? Is your sense of your own place when you're working in those spaces, has it been very different from place to place?
I think I felt in China, I guess it was so clear that I was an outsider, and I don't look Chinese particularly. So there wasn't so much ambiguity in a sense. I felt very much an outsider, but I felt a connection to these people, and I think because I was half Chinese, I felt I had a reason to be there, and a reason to kind of be photographing what I was photographing. So I don't know if that answers your question. I've always felt a little bit of the sense of having one foot in one space and one foot out, maybe partly because of being biracial, like not quite knowing where I fit in. So in a way, it's, going to these spaces where I'm neither an insider or an outsider, has felt in some ways natural to me, or in a way it's maybe something that I've sought out. The sense of in-betweenness. And I think in North Philadelphia, even though it's my home city, I felt even more like an outsider, I think, when I went back to North Philadelphia. I think because, in a way, I guess you could say that, like, the thinking that I had made about looking at sort of the margins of China and sort of applying it to North Philadelphia didn't really work, because it's really a very different story.
Right.
It's not. It's also about division and about inequality, but it's a completely different framework and context. So I think when I started photographing in North Philadelphia, I pretty quickly became aware that I was in, I don't know, not there was something kind of problematic about what I was doing in a sense, because yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, one of the things that's always struck me about these portraits, and this one you have up is actually one of my favorites. You were making this work almost simultaneously with Zoe Strauss when she was working in Philadelphia, right, and making her body of work, which is so different from yours. I mean, she was using a small handheld camera, and she was, her mode is to kind of run around and almost, steal pictures at different times, and also to get to know people, but very furtively and quickly. And you were working with a view camera when you made these, and that always, just blows me away, because you're if I'm correct, you had a tripod and a whole setup. So you're asking these people to really take you seriously, and you're clearly, treating them with serious regard. And there's not a lot of street portraiture where that's what happens. And I think it really, for me, what it did is it gets these people looking back at you. I mean, they're looking at you as much as anything else, and it's very effective. These are terrific portraits.
I was aware of Zoe's work at the time when I was starting the project, and I think I consciously. I think I spent a few months actually working with a medium format camera before I decided to work with a large format camera. And I think I was really, I didn't want to, because I was working in this space that was so charged, in a sense, there were so many issues of stereotypes, and, as a white person going in with a camera, the sort of power imbalance, and I didn't want to, I guess, perpetuate, looking at this neighborhood as a blighted neighborhood, or going in, sort of stealing pictures and not interacting with the people. So I guess I decided that working with a view camera, in a way, one thing it did, it made me more visible and more vulnerable in some ways, which I think brought a different openness to the people that I encountered. I mean, some people were suspicious to some extent. I mean, actually, a lot of people hadn't seen a viewed camera before, and they thought, one reaction I got was, "Are you like a land surveyor or like a real estate developer?"
Yeah, no, because that's surveyors have their equipment looks like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of similarity. It's on a tripod. It's so a lot of people would come up to me and ask what I was doing, and that became a good way to sort of an opening to talk and to kind of get to know people. And the other thing is, with the view camera, it lends a kind of ambiguity to what you're looking at. I feel like sometimes with smaller cameras that are maybe more associated with photojournalism, there's more of an agenda attached to it. You're sort of telling a specific story, or you have something you're trying to communicate more directly. But I found with the view camera, there's a lot more ambiguity, partly because there's more detail, there's a kind of formality to the image. So I didn't really want to, I wasn't, on the surface, I was trying to talk about, the inequality, but I also was more interested in just the sort of experience of being in that landscape and how I was responding to it, and kind of showing the complexity of these spaces, like these. These vacant lots are, on the surface, you would think that they're these kind of blighted, desolate spaces. But I guess what I was experiencing was that it's not so straightforward. They're actually, yes, they're places where a building had been torn down, and it is a kind of an example of blight, but it's also, it's almost like this lush window into this rainforest. It's very ambiguous, and that was kind of what I wanted to show, and that's something that worked better with the landscape, with the large format camera.
And this particular photograph is one that's in the exhibition at PMA right now. And you and I talked a lot because we knew we wanted one landscape, and we went back and forth, I remember, about which one. And you really pushed on this one, and I'm so glad you did. In part because, it's a beautiful, as you said, a very lush landscape. But what I've encountered since the show was installed is that many people are drawn to it and are, it gives them pleasure on this kind of basic level. And to me, that's very fascinating about it, because it is an empty lot, but you have managed to make this kind of summer idyll. It's like a Watteau or something in the middle of the frame.
I'll go back to your question about not naming the people. One issue was that it was kind of inconsistent, the interactions that I had. Some people I got to know pretty well. This woman's name was Helen, and she, I got to know, where she lived and a bit about her life. But other people were sort of more resistant, or didn't want to tell me too much. And I think later on, when I was editing the project, I felt, partly I didn't want to have, some names and not names for others. So I sort of made a decision to not name anyone, just to kind of keep a kind of distance and formality. And I also felt a little bit like there was a kind of glibness, or if I named everybody, and the fact is I don't. These people are basically strangers to me, so it wasn't. It felt a little bit strange to give people, to name everybody. I don't know. I'm not quite sure if I would do it the same way if I, did going forward, if I did do projects like this. But at the time, that's kind of the decision I made. I guess I wanted to keep a certain formality, and also not give too much information. I guess I wanted to kind of keep the focus on the image itself, and not give too much too many words to kind of interpret the image.
Yeah, this is an interesting example of how much a title can change a work, or sort of change its emphasis or its meaning. And I fully understand your choice. I think it was probably the right choice, because they are very specific portraits, but the absence of specific names also gives them a kind of generality that I think is really strong.
Yeah, one thing I should say is this. When I was doing this project, there was 2008, 2009, I was kind of going through like a kind of China withdrawal. So that, I was really having a hard time in my own life for lots of different reasons. And, I was in China for 10 years and then suddenly kind of coming back to my hometown. So the process of making these photographs was really quite personal, even though my initial agenda was, more, I don't know, wanting to look at these kind of broader issues, but it became sort of, I don't know if you could say therapeutic, but it meant a lot for me to kind of, it was helpful for me to kind of go out and make these photographs every day, and it became a kind of anchor for me to kind of look for images that spoke to me and sort of offered me some kind of I don't know, information about myself, what I needed at that time in my life. I mean, in general, that's how photography has functioned for me. I've always done quite a lot of different things. Like I work as a filmmaker and a cinematographer, but still photography has always been this very personal practice where I'm kind of using, going out and sort of, in a way, collecting these moments or images that, in a way, they're kind of like touchstones for my own life and kind of lead me forward. Not saying that very clearly, but
no, it makes sense. When you see a group of these portraits together, as we are here, and as you can in the exhibition, it's you get such a sense of individual personalities. I think partly because you print them almost at life size, right? I mean, they're quite monumental. And I mean, this woman's pose is just so self-assured. I mean, that's how I read it anyway. It's really striking.
So one thing that when I was doing the North Philadelphia work, I kept coming across the Chinese takeout restaurants that are all over America, but specifically there's almost on every corner in North Philadelphia and other parts of the city, you find these restaurants. And I, partly coming from China at that time, was sort of attuned to anything Chinese. So it became kind of a sub series. These Chinese takeout restaurants. Mostly at the time, I just focused on the facades, partly because I didn't quite know how to interact. I didn't know how to kind of go further with that story at the time. So I kind of left it as these kind of facades at night. But actually, in the last several months, I decided to go back to that project. I'd been thinking about it for quite a long time, wanting to kind of revisit the project. But I'll show you at the end of the talk a few pictures that I've been making in Chinese takeout restaurants. So I'm going to move ahead to Little North Road. So one thing I should say, I mentioned that I was having kind of China withdrawal the first couple of years that I was back, and I mean that was partly because I had spent 10 years in China, so my whole life was there, and all my friends and actually my professional life was largely still there. And part of the struggle I was having was kind of how to rebuild my life in the States. And what I ended up doing was actually just going back to China because that was the primary place where I could still make a living. So I ended up hopping on a plane every several months and going back to China and taking assignments and doing other projects there. And actually it was exhausting, but it was a pretty interesting life at the same time. And during that time, I was working on magazine assignments, and I started to become aware of the China-Africa relationship. China, probably around 2005, but more pronounced after the Olympics, was kind of going out on more and more onto the world stage, interacting with, investing in places all over the world, Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia. But I became particularly interested in the China-Africa relationship. China was really kind of funding all the major infrastructure projects in many infrastructure projects in Africa at the time. And I guess for me, there was a sense of the strangeness of these two cultures, kind of like how they would interact. And strangely, I was doing the work in North Philadelphia at the time, but I didn't really make a connection. I guess because in some ways, they were so, they didn't really seem, the story is so different. They're both in part about the African diaspora in a sense, but I didn't really make a connection. And in a way, this is kind of the first time the two projects have been shown together, even though they were made at the same time. So anyway, I did some work in Africa looking at Chinese projects and kind of work sites, but I became aware of this one community or neighborhood in Guangzhou.
Daniel, I'm just going to break in to say that we're about 8 minutes from 8 o'clock.
Okay. Okay.
Just
sorry. Okay, so I'll just be very quick. So this project was about this pedestrian bridge where it was almost like this metaphorical bridge of where people from the global south would come into China. It was a place where both migrant workers from China and migrants from Africa and the Middle East kind of interacted on this bridge. And for me, it was kind of a remarkable place because these are all people that are on the margins of China, but they created this kind of marketplace and community on this bridge. And I started documenting the space as kind of in a very straightforward way, but I came across these two Chinese photographers, migrant photographers, who were making a living, making these sort of souvenir pictures of people on the bridge. And they were doing it purely as a way to make a living. So what I did was I gave them both hard drives to collect their photographs. So we sort of I enlisted them on this project. And over a period of 6 years, I collected about 25,000 of both of their photographs. I'm
just going to break in, Daniel, to explain to everybody that when the museum bought 2 of your landscapes from this series, part of the project was that you said, we also should buy work by Zinn and Wu. And so we did. I mean, you not only have saved this work, but you've gotten it into other institutions as sort of an archival presence.
I mean, for me, it was originally, I thought it would be my project, but when I saw their photographs, in a sense, I let my own photographs be the frame to look at these portraits, because in a sense, they tell something that I could never do, because in a sense, it's two migrant groups documenting each other. So in a way, it's not a Western photographer kind of looking in. It's really this, these two groups creating a record of this moment where people from the global south were sort of pouring into Guangzhou. And in fact, it became a record of a moment that's already passed, because China, because they were very suspicious or uncomfortable with with Africans to some extent out of racism coming to China, they really closed down this whole market in this whole neighborhood. So there's very much fewer people, Africans coming into China. For me, it was also a response, that China was, so involved in Africa. There's, something like 1 million Chinese in Africa, but they were very resistant to the kind of the reverse flow, reverse migration. So for me, there was a kind of, wanting to preserve that moment. And this is the other photographer that I was working with. So I'll zip through. This is the whole area became this kind of very festive carnival had this carnival-like atmosphere at night. So I'll skip ahead to these recent pictures that I've been making about the Chinese takeout restaurants. So this is a delivery bike handlebar. You
remember I made you promise you had to explain this one.
It's not blood. It's actually plastic, a red plastic bag.
I looked at it for an hour before we spoke, trying to figure out what trauma had occurred to this poor delivery person.
Right. They were just, these are to protect their hands, I guess, when they're biking. But the majority of this project is actually about the interior of these Chinese takeout spaces. I mean, I'm still very much really starting this project, so I'm not quite sure where it's going to go. But as I said, I had been thinking about how to kind of approach this project for a long time, and I was a little resistant because I guess I assumed that they would, I wouldn't be allowed to do it. They would just tell me to, get lost. But a few months ago, partly I think because of the pandemic, I was curious about these spaces because in a way they're already they're kind of set up for the pandemic. they already have the plexiglass division, and so I was kind of curious in that way. So I started going to the spaces, and the people were very open to me photographing, surprisingly. I guess but the store owners, because I spoke Chinese and could talk to them, and they were kind of interested in why I was interested. But I think for me, what is compelling about the spaces is that they're kind of like these in between zones. It's almost like a foyer between the neighborhood and the Chinese merchants in the back. They're kind of like these in between spaces where they interact, but in a way the neighborhood owns the front space. So in a way you find all these kind of they're almost like these I don't know, it's like a living room for the neighborhood. These kind of like community spaces, and at night people hang out in front on the street corners. But the Chinese merchants are always kind of barricaded in the back, living in their own world. But they interact at the counter. But the front space is like this very often lively, complex space where almost like this theater that sort of things happen there.
Wow.
But it's also interesting because there's particularly in places like North Philadelphia, there aren't many options for food, and so these restaurants are one of the few places where you can get food, and it's such an intimate thing, where you're you're feeding people, but in a way there's this kind of distance between these two groups. So it's really it relates a lot to the Little North Road project, but in kind of a different variation in a lot of ways.
Wow, I love these. I mean, I think this is, I'm excited about this series, and I want to see more of it.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, for me, they're a bit like, I mean, these pictures without people feel a bit like landscapes in their own way. So yeah, I'm excited too, because I'm not quite sure where it's going to go. And this is the last image.
Have you gone to any of these restaurants in New York neighborhoods, or you've just been working in Philly?
I did a bit in Queens, but that was maybe in 2018. But somehow it didn't quite gel when I was photographing there. I mean, I think maybe because Philadelphia is my hometown, some things happen here for me. Yeah, so it's somehow I feel more connected to photographing here. So that's it.
Well, thank you, Daniel. That was great. I loved seeing the early work from the 90s and the early 2000s in China, as well as this new work. It was really
thank you,
eye-opening. Does anybody else have questions they want to ask?
I have about 100 questions. There are the idea of the road and the bridge and the intersection of different people. I think I just want to it's just such a wonderful project, and I really do see this work in the takeaways developing. But there's, I mean, in a way, you really photograph it as neutral ground in a way, and I'm just curious about that, because it isn't. It's contested ground in many ways too, because it's all of the barricades and everything. There's a lack of trust in the communities, between the two communities, and your eye is really just direct and allowing the space to sort of explain itself. But it doesn't feel like there's any tension. And I'm just curious as how what are you thinking when you're in these spaces? And is that your intention?
In the Chinese takeout?
Yeah, I think in the Chinese takeout, I think is where this question is rooted. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know where it's going to go yet. I mean, I'm still kind of exploring, but I mean, what I've been doing so far is kind of just hanging out in the space and seeing what happens, and sort of seeing how people respond to me. And what I found actually is I can become kind of invisible, strangely. And people have they say what I'm doing, they ask me what I'm doing, and then they're like, oh, okay, yeah, fine. And then I can just kind of do what I want. And yeah, so I'm not quite sure. I mean, it's kind of remarkable. It's not at all what I expected. So I'm quite excited to see where that goes. But I mean, I feel a kind of sympathy to both groups, because I speak Chinese, and I understand that the people behind the counter, they're almost all from Fujian province in southern China, and they're these people that they've been here for a year or even 10 years, but they really stay to themselves or to other Chinese groups, and they don't really have a way to interact with the people that they're serving. I mean, in a way, I'm not sure they're that interested. I mean, I think it's a way for them. They're also people that are struggling to make a living. A lot of them came here through snakeheads, through gangs, and they have huge debts to pay back, and they have to kind of figure out how to do that. And a lot of times they're also sometimes it's families that are operating these, but other times they're people that are sort of swapped between different restaurants all over the country. So they, in a way, they don't have a chance to become rooted in any one place. So it's a really difficult situation for them. So yeah, and yeah, the people that I've encountered, I think. The customers, I think they have a pretty complicated relationship too. I think there is a kind of resentment. It's like this foreign, these foreigners coming here and taking their money and serving them kung pao chicken. Who knows how good the quality is? But at the same time, there's not too many options for food, and also it's I guess it tastes pretty good, the food. So it's they have they like Chinese food, and So it's a really rich, complex space. Yeah.
It's okay if we want to hang out, y'all. If people have questions, please feel free to ask and unmute yourself. And let's just try to, maybe we can go for 10 more minutes and keep that space open, because I know that there's a lot of people that were not bored at all. They said, keep going. So we can keep talking.
Daniel, I want to ask about pictures you didn't show. We don't have to talk about them much, but I know you were living in New York just before you moved back to Philly a few years ago. And you made these really interesting photographs in Queens of, sort of like front yards, or in some cases there were driveways, and, tons of fencing between yards with all these barriers between spaces that belong to different people. And these Chinese takeout photographs are reminding me of those because of the barriers that Laurie referred to. And I'm just curious, when you were making that work, I don't know if it was an ethnic neighborhood or what the context was, but what were you thinking about, and how does it relate at all to what's going on here?
I mean, Queens is, it's cited as the most diverse place on earth by some people. So what I was looking at was how, I guess, how the people that are coming to Queens, the immigrants, from lots of different places, how their sensibility, how what they bring to New York, how that is really inscribed on the landscape. How people transform their front yards, or how they, bring their culture to kind of making their space their own. Yeah. So that's kind of what I was looking at. I mean, the edit that I've narrowed that down to is really pretty specific about that. I mean, I did a lot of other work about portraits and lots of different things in Queens, but I guess I became more. I felt that was the clearest edit of what I was looking at in Queens. But yeah, I think it's certainly related in the sense that it's about immigrants and people that are kind of not have a foot in two worlds, in America and elsewhere.
Daniel, do you think you could, you ended, you're still doing the project, I guess, but in North Philly, but do you feel that you could continue doing it there because of the amount of gun violence that's going on? I mean, last year, 500 people died in West Philly. I guess, are you doing close to West Philly or just north? Well, it's northwest.
North Philly, yeah. I mean, that project actually, I finished that project in 2013, so quite a long time ago.
Okay.
But so it's not, I've been photographing. I mean, through the pandemic, I was photographing all over the city and doing lots of kind of exploring, but nothing really gelled into a real project. But yeah, I mean, when I was photographing in North Philadelphia, there was also a lot of gun violence and all these things, and so I don't know. I don't think about it too much, actually. I guess partly with that camera, in a funny way, it made me more vulnerable, but also I felt safer with the large format camera, because I felt like people sensed that I was doing something, that I had a reason to be there somehow. And since you mentioned gun violence, I will say that just about a week ago, I got an email from a teacher in the public school system who went to see the exhibit at the museum, and she said that I don't know if you remember. I'll go back to it. The photograph of the two boys. What the boy on the right was her student, and she said that he had been killed just a couple months ago. through gun violence. So I was pretty shocked by that, and I remembered his name is Pierre, and he was really intense. And, but I guess it sort of made, I mean, the fact that she reached out to me and, let me know that this had happened, she kind of appreciated that I had made this picture. And so that was nice, good to hear. And I've been trying to reach out to the family actually, and to try to give them this portrait.
Daniel.
Yeah, just imagine if these kids could have cameras instead of guns. Wow, what a different city, and what a revelation it would be. So,
Daniel, I'm really sorry to hear about the loss of Pierre. I photographed people that have since passed, and there is an element of loss. Not, I don't know. It's impactful for me as an artist and as a portrait photographer. But the thing that I wanted to ask you was that there is a softness to your portraits that I could never attain in my own portrait work, and it makes us very different portrait photographers. And so I'm just wondering, are you? I'm sure you're aware of the softness that you have, and I don't know how you achieve it. I don't know if it's through conversation with your subjects or the medium, or a combination of things. I'm just kind of curious to hear your thoughts about that.
I mean, I think it partly it's, for these pictures, I have to give some credit to the format. I mean, I think large format, there's a kind of, I think the slowness of the process, it takes so much time to set it up and to focus and all that. I think people, in a way, they forget about you. they kind of go back into their own world a little bit and sort of.
There's more than that. I mean, I think the camera has something to do with it, but I think I don't know if it's you and your interaction with the people, or your selection of
maybe
them.
Yeah, I mean, as I was saying, I tend to shoot a lot. I with these boys, I probably shot I forget how many, but maybe 5 or 6 frames, or maybe more. I mean, sometimes I do more if I can. So a lot of it's the editing. Like I tend to choose the frame that speaks to me, that I feel that works the best. And I don't know, maybe it's my personality, so how people respond to me. I don't know.
It must be. I've never made a soft portrait. No matter what format I use. So there must be some sort of energy or synergy between you and your subjects that they're just really beautiful, and they're when I say soft, it means like an emotional, empathetic, personal thing that's I think is really unique about your portraits. I mean, the other startling portrait is the horizontal one of the 2 people in China with the white shirts. It reminded me of this. I had never seen that picture before, and I immediately thought of this one.
Right.
That one. There's such a tenderness, not only in the way that they look at you, but also when you're photographing more than one, a tenderness between the 2 people that feels really genuine and authentic and not performative for the camera.
I've recently I've been posting some pictures that I made in Nablus in the West Bank, and I actually have another picture of two young men that, and they could almost be a series of two men, but they all sort of feel quite similar. I'm not sure what I have with 2 young men.
Your portraits are absolutely wonderful. Can you hear me? Oh, God.
Yeah.
Yep,
Yep.
we hear you,
Oh.
Marianne. Yeah, I mean, they, to build on what Sarah said, Daniel, there's just so much presence of each of these people. And the fact, when you see them on the wall, when you're in front of them, the fact that they're, as I said, they're almost life size in the case of the Philadelphia pictures. They're just really, they just hold you there. I love this picture too. I'm glad you mentioned it, Sarah, because I didn't know what to say about it when Daniel first showed it, but I haven't seen it before tonight. I think it's really, really strong.
And I love the young girl sitting on the wall. It's before the portrait of the young girl in China. Colorful.
This one.
Yes, there.
Oh yeah.
It's beautiful. The background, the colors are so beautiful.
Yeah, it was so appropriate. You said that they were at this point in China where they were trying to find their own fashion statement. Because I was looking at her hands and I said, what's going on? Her skin color, and then back to her hands. And I didn't realize there was some kind of gloves. And then I saw the end of it and I wasn't sure what was happening there. It was certainly an amalgam of fashion things that I've never seen before, and certainly finding her way. It's quite fascinating.
I actually, when I was making these pictures, I was actually thinking of there was something theatrical about Beijing at that time, just the way people were kind of experimenting with how to present themselves in terms of fashion, or just how to gesture and everything. There was some sense of the backdrop, like the stage set of China at that time was in this kind of constant flux, and it was almost like this sense of people trying to kind of keep up with the backdrop that kept changing in a sense.
And that one shot you had with all the doors, I mean, that was theatrical in itself, that people, it was almost as if it was stage doors. They were taking down buildings and then they were trying to recreate sets, but sets for their own living. And then it disappeared, just like a stage production would, for some reason. And then when you went back, I mean, that's a fascinating photo,
I mean, one thing about China is it's really, I mean, that particular time when I was there, up until, I don't know, 10 years ago, it was really quite a special time, like leading up to the Olympics, where it was everything was kind of in flux, and China wasn't quite as confident as it is now, in a sense. It was really trying to kind of find its footing, and I think the China that's now present is really in a way more solidified. It's in terms of power and its sense of itself, but it's also in terms of the infrastructure, it's in a way much more advanced than we are. There's much more technology that's implemented in everyday life, and nobody uses money really. They all use cell phones to pay for everything. So in a way, it's much more defined as a country in a sense.
Would you be questioned a lot more in China going back with a 4x5 camera, which is like out there in the public?
I don't know, actually. I mean, I haven't been back in about 3 years.
Okay.
So I've kind of lost touch with what's happening there now a little bit.
Okay.
Daniel, this has just been amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you
all.
so much.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
Thank you both. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Daniel. This was a beautiful presentation. I've been waiting a long time for this one, Daniel.
Thank you, Laura.
And it was really great. It was worth the wait. Congratulations to you both on New Grit. I can't wait to see the show. And I hope to see the people who came in tonight back at another Thursday night photo talk. Next week, Larry Cook is going to be giving a talk about reframing the carceral space. He's an assistant professor at Howard University and has been working in prisons and and doing work about photography in prisons. So I welcome you back. Peter, Daniel, thank you.
Thank
Yes.
you, Laura.
Thank you,
Thank
Peter.
you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Daniel.
Peter. Thanks, Sarah.
Nice to see everybody.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone,
everybody,
for
for
being
coming.
here. And I got my tickets for New Grit, so I'll see you 2 weeks from now. Take care, everyone. Have a good night.
Good night.
Nice.